Afternoon, colleagues, friends. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really delighted to see old and new friends in the room today. It's really my great pleasure to welcome Professor Vittorio Gallese, full professor of human physiology from the University of Parma. Before I introduce Professor Gallese, I just want to say, as director of the Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society, which is hosting this this event, that we're really, really delighted to be able to collaborate in bringing Dr. Gallese here with a pretty wide range of entities on campus who we're very delighted to collaborate with. Foremost among which is the Department of Italian Studies, but also the Townsend Center for the Humanities, the Department of Slavic Languages and Literature, Department of Scandinavian Studies, and within our center, of course, the Office for History of Science and Technology. So I want to thank all of you for helping make this possible. And just say a few words about Dr. Gallese, whose CV is far too long to actually represent adequately here. Just to say that he is, in addition to being full professor of human physiology, he's also the coordinator of the PhD program in neuroscience at the University of Parma. He has received numerous awards, including the 2010 Arnold Pfeiffer Prize for Neuropsychoanalysis from the International Neuropsychoanalysis Society. In 2002, many of you will already know this, he was a professor here at Berkeley in the Department of Neuroscience. His very interesting, unique work focuses on the relationship between action, perception, and cognition. And he is also very actively developing an interdisciplinary approach to questions of the embodied bases of intersubjectivity and social cognition. And it's precisely that work on embodied experience, on the body in aesthetic experience, that he is going to be talking to us about today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gallese. Thank you so much for coming.
This is what necktie are for. So thank you so much for the nice introduction. Thank you, all of you, for coming and for inviting me here. As you may see, I decided to open my talk with this wonderful Paul Klee, which is probably telling metaphor of what I'm up to this afternoon, namely an exercise of perilous balance. Let me start with this question. Why do we need neuroaesthetics? Why neuroaesthetics? As you probably know, one of the ways are currently available to study brain function is brain imaging. Brain imaging is an indirect measure of neural activity. Basically what we do is infer that a given population of nervous cells are relevant and therefore more active in a given task. And what we are measuring is not actually neural activity, but what we are measuring is the blood flow, which is normally increasing when the neurons in a specific area of the brain are more active because supposedly and hopefully they are task relevant. So we have these wonderful images. So there has been someone who has said, well, but after all, this is fashion. So one way of looking at these images is like the contemporary version of Wunderkammer. So something which is intrinsically beautiful, but whose meaning is far from clear. So neuroscience is nowadays targeting a variety of domains, not only aesthetics, but we have neuroethics, neuroeconomics. So another legitimate question to be asked is, are we dealing with a sort of neurohubris? I mean, are we going nuts? Are we believing that we can explain everything by merely scanning the brains of the people? So to elaborate further this issue, one may add that many scholars in the humanities believe that a neuroscientific approach to aesthetics, while unable to add anything new about art and aesthetics, may eventually even do worse. That is, hinder, if not even destroy, the magic and wonder that normally comes along with our appreciation of art. Then I would like to ask my fellow citizen, Giuseppe Verdi, in help. I don't want to take this sentence, I don't want to rely on this sentence in general. It may be very dangerous. It means let's go back to the past and progress will ensue. This is not necessarily true. Actually, most of the time it isn't true. But in this particular case, it might be true. Let me tell you why. This is one of my heroes. Why? Because Abby Warburg wasn't afraid to, so to speak, contaminate himself with science. Actually, science played a major role in helping him develop his ideas about art. When he was in Florence, one of the books he read with most passion was the real bestseller of Darwin, The Expression of the Emotion in Man and Animals. He saw in Darwin's book the possibility to enlarge art history to include the transmission of emotions in pictures. And Warburg's copy of the book is inscribed literally, "Finally a book that helps me." So, according to Warburg, a theory of artistic style must be conceived as a pragmatic science of expression. Die pragmatische Ausdruckskunde. Pardon my German. So he relied heavily on contemporary science. Namely, he relied heavily on the discoveries that were piling up in Germany by several distinguished scholars, particularly physiologists, like Richard Semon. So the notion of neme and the notion of engram, of mnemic trace, was literally borrowed by the writings of this German physiologist, who is Richard Semon. Let me briefly touch the issue of pathos formen. So what are pathos formen in Warburg's account? They are a variety of bodily postures, gestures, and actions that can be constantly detected in art history from classic art to the Renaissance period. And why is that? Because they embody in an exemplary fashion the aesthetic act of empathy as one of the main creative sources of artistic style. Okay, after this brief parenthesis, let's switch back to contemporary times. So aesthetics and neuroscience can lead to a variety of possible solutions. So one possible way to go is this one. This is a paper that came out very recently, last year, by a very well-known and distinguished neuroscientist. Actually, I think Semir Zeki, together with Jubel and Wiesel, is the neuroscientist who helped us most to understand how the visual part of our brain works. He's very well known in Berkeley because he organized several meetings at the local Contemporary Art Museum. I was there in 2005, perhaps. So one possible way to go is what he's up to, namely to locate in the brain the sense of beauty. which is what reportedly he's referring in this paper. So they were having their volunteers in the brain scanner, watching famous masterworks, paintings, listening to music, Chopin, I don't remember exactly, and what they were trying to do is to verify whether there was a correlation between the aesthetic judgment that participants gave to the artworks they were beholding or listening to and the activation in a given regions of the brain. And apparently it turns out that this particular region in the mesial part of the frontal lobe, the ventromesial orbitofrontal cortex, activated the more they rated as aesthetically beautiful what they were looking at or what they were listening to. This is not my research agenda. I'm on a different, so to speak, wavelength. I think they are both complementary. What really dragged me into aesthetics is the possibility to use cognitive neuroscience to study the functional relationship between our brain-body system and aesthetic experience. Why? Well, this is a quote from a recent article that Giorgio Agamben published in the Italian newspaper La Repubblica, a very nice article on the religion of money. And he was concluding this article with this statement: l'archeologia, non la futurologia, è la sola via d'accesso al presente. So if you want to understand our present, we don't need futurology, but we should stick to archaeology. Why I think this is relevant? Because I tend to interpret what I'm doing, cognitive neuroscience, as a sort of cognitive archaeology. Cognitive archaeology in a variety of meanings. Cognitive archaeology because by studying animal models of the human brain, like the brain of non-human primates, we have a key to address the topic of phylogeny. How we came to evolve a brain-body system enabling the kind of mind that we all have and use. Archaeology in a perhaps even more interesting sense, because one can think, as I do, that it is always possible to deconstruct complex entities into simpler entities that are more amenable to empirical research. And in that respect, aesthetic experience, I think, is crucial for cognitive neuroscience because it provides an ideal way of studying the variety of worlds that we inhabit. I am a materialist, so I do believe that this is real. I do believe that outside there are trees, there is a sky, which, by the way, is not blue, and the grass is not green. It is green and blue for me, but not for my cat, Lucchino, for example. I do believe in a material world, but I think we are constantly inhabiting a variety of intermediate worlds. And the intermediate world, which is constituted by what we call aesthetic experience, is very interesting because it provides a prototypical case to understand also the other varieties of worlds that from which we switch on and off constantly in our daily transaction with reality. There is a further element of interest for someone like me in addressing the topic of aesthetic experience from the vantage point of cognitive neuroscience, because aesthetics is a mediated form of intersubjectivity. So in other words, the artwork acts as a sort of mediator between a variety of individuals. The artist on the one hand and the beholder of the people who have a more passive relationship with the artwork, which is not passive at all, as we will see in a minute, but at the very least who were not directly involved in the first place in creating the artwork. They might be involved in recreating it in their own experience. Here is another contemporary Italian philosopher who is, unlike Agamben, very little translated in English, with the only exception of his political writings on radical thought. This is a quote from his last book, E così via all'infinito, which is a book that specifically focuses on language, where he writes, I took the liberty of translating it into English. It is legitimate to postulate the existence of an original intersubjectivity which is anterior to formation of distinctive individual subjects. The human mind, contrary to what one might deduce from the methodological solipsism of the cognitive sciences, is originally public or collective. When Vierno refers to this public or collective dimension, he speaks of comune, common, the common, or the pre-individual. I think that in many respects, this is not to flatter an audience of scholars in the humanities. I really mean what is in this slide. I think art very often anticipates science, and I think this quote from Dante Purgatorio makes quite nicely the case. Dante is addressing, I believe, Folchetto da Marsiglia, and he attributes to one of the inhabitants of the Purgatorio a distinctive feature that clearly Dante believes to be precluded to living embodied human beings. The faculty, the possibility to have a direct access to the other, and he conveys this meaning with this incredible creative usage of the Italian language, turning the word tu e me into verbs. I wouldn't wait for your question, s'io m'intuassi come tu ti mi. The point I want to make is that this is by all means not an exclusive prerogative of holy souls. So in other words, we don't need to wait to go to heaven or at the very least to the mountain of Purgatorio, but we can do it even here. We do it all the time. We have a direct way of accessing the mind of the other individuals, and one component of this capacity is enabled, is allowed by the fact that we have in our brain-body system neural mechanisms that do activate not only when we do something, but also when we see someone else doing the same. So this is a cartoon rendition of me or of one of my colleagues while we are grasping a piece of apple in front of a monkey, which in turn grasps the piece of food herself. And what we see, these short lines, each of these short lines is an action potential. So it's a spike fired by that very same neuron, both when the action is performed by the monkey, but also when the action is observed being performed by someone else. So let's leave the monkey business and turn to the human brain. And so basically, to very quickly recap what we think we understood in the last 20 years, we discovered them in the July of 1991. And next August, the end of August, we will have an international meeting in Erice, in Sicily, just to see where are we 20 years after the publication of the very first paper. So what we understood so far is that the same cortical sites, also in our brain, which are these colored in this lateral cartoon of a lateral view of the human brain, the same cortical sites are activated during the execution, but also during the observation of object-directed actions, grasping objects, biting apples, kicking footballs, and so much so forth, communicative actions, or body movements, apparently totally meaningless like dancing, for example. That was the beginning of a story that it's in progress. So this mirror mechanism not only applies to the domain of action, but also applies to the domain of emotion and sensations. So there are other regions in our brain that are activated when we experience a given emotion, like, for example, disgust or fear, or when we experience sensations like pain or touch. But the very same brain regions are also active when we witness those very same emotion and sensation being experienced by someone else. So I put forward this theory, the theory of embodied simulation, which was an attempt to provide a unified theoretical framework that may account in a unified way of this variety of mirroring mechanisms that we and other colleagues have been detecting in the human brain in the last 10 to 15 years. So what is embodied simulation? Embodied simulation is a basic functional mechanism which we take to play a role in social cognition, as we have seen briefly, not confined to the domain of action, but encompassing also other aspects of which characterize intersubjectivity, such as emotion and sensation. I have to add something here. I mean, I'm treating action, emotion, and sensation as separate domains. This is clearly false. I mean, every action I perform or every action I witness being performed by someone else is always characterized by an affective content. Why then am I speaking of action, emotion, and sensation as if I were referring to separate domains? This is the outcome of our peculiar approach. Our methodological reductionism make us think that at this stage of our investigation, of our empirical investigation, it is better to study not social cognition as it really is, but in a way you may think we are studying, we are making up a sort of a gross caricature of social cognition, which, however, makes this complex entity more amenable to the empirical investigation. The only point that one should bear in mind is being aware that what I'm showing you is not the real thing, is the outcome of a methodological approach which feels the necessity to reduce the complexity, but with the ultimate goal to, as our understanding of these things develop, trying to go back to the real level of description which matters, which is the personal level of description. So I'm studying neurons not because a neuron freak, but because I think that studying neurons make me understand something new, offers me a new perspective to address the ultimate goal, which should be also that we all share in this room, which is to understand who we are. What does it mean to be a human being? You do it with your own technicalities. I'm doing it with my own technicalities. But we are ultimately, we share the same goal. And I think it is very important that we keep talking to each other, because I learned a lot from you, since my ultimate goal is to go back to the personal level of description, and neurons don't think, don't dream, don't love, don't hate. That's a prerogative of the personal level of description. By perhaps in a presumptuous way, I think that breaking up the personal level of description and investigating disgust, passion, love, envy, at a level that can be described in subpersonal, at a subpersonal level, when coming back to the personal level of description, I can tell you something new that might be possibly relevant even for people like you whose main goal is to understand this personal level of description, studying art, literature. So because of a shared bodily representational format, I have mirror neurons, you have mirror neurons, we map the actions of others onto our own motor representations, as well as others' emotion and sensation onto our own visceromotor and sensory motor representation. So both self and other appear to be intertwined because of the intercorporeality that links self to other. So intercorporeality describes a crucial aspect of intersubjectivity because we and others share the same intentional objects, and our situated motor system are similarly wired to accomplish similar goals, which of course it doesn't imply that the way I am looking at this bottle is identical to the way you are looking at it. Actually, colleagues of mine and our group are starting to factor out, to investigate specifically the enormous inter-individual variability. And there are very interesting experiments showing that if two groups of people look at the very same images, the video of your partner displaying a painful expression, even if at the cognitive level they accomplish the very same result, so they are equally capable of rating the unpleasantness and the intensity of the pain being experienced by their partner they are watching in the video, they do it, they accomplish these cognitive results by activating completely different brain circuits. So people who we could define them phobic prone do activate, for example, the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, while individuals that overall, because of their personality profile, we could technically define eating disorder prone. So they are not anorexic, they are not phobic, but if eventually they will suffer something in their life that will lead them to turn into psychopathology, the eating disorder prone do not absolutely activate the insula. They activate a lot more visual areas in the back of their brain, the precuneus, the prefrontal cortex, but no insula, no anterior cingulate cortex at all. So this huge, so the relevance of my individual personal history is something that neuroscience is only beginning to address as we speak. Okay. Many of your colleagues are becoming interested in learning more about neuroscience. Here is one example. Patrick Colm-Hogan, his last book, What Literature Teaches Us About Emotion. And so you see, I mean, here we have another perspective. So I want to learn about emotion, I do neuroscience. But if I want to learn about emotion, I can do literary studies, because probably it's, one may think, and probably I think it's fair to say so, I can learn a lot more about what it is like to be a human being reading Karamazov than reading a pile of fMRI papers. However, why do we still want to do fMRI studies? Because we add another perspective. And the more perspective we have, I think, the better we are in learning something more about who we are. So Hogan, in the beginning of his book, also writes, with respect to verbal art, we enjoy simulation. The existence of literature itself, the systematic simulation of emotional experience. This is one aspect of literature which is poignant, very important, according to Hogan. Here is another quote from Amy Copland. In 2004, she published this paper on the role of empathy in the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, where she wrote, empathic perspective taking is a standard part of readers' engagement with fictional narratives. And one of the main reasons why I'm here is because I was so lucky to meet this colleague of yours, Hannah Chappell-Wachowski, who is professor of English at Austin University. Together we wrote a paper that you might read online, just came out, in California Italian Studies, where we try to chart the territory and see to which extent the combination of an English scholar and a cognitive neuroscientist can shed new light on literature on the one hand and on the human mind on the other. But I won't touch what we wrote in this paper because I have no empirical result to show you. And without empirical result, I feel kind of naked. I mean, I feel embarrassed. So I will tell you more about visual arts where we do have indeed a few new empirical results. So our relationship with images, according to some colleagues, one shouldn't even talk about images. There are people who claim that images do not exist. But anyway, that would lead us way too far. So I think it is an undisputable truth that the relationship between an image and the beholder is a manifold, okay? So the term aesthetic experience refers to a multi-layered state in which several dimensions can be distinguished. And one big mistake of cognitive neuroscience would be not to be aware of this multi-layered nature of what an aesthetic experience is all about. So what I did recently with a young colleague of mine was to trying to dissect this manifold into simpler dimensions. And if we want to study the neural correlate of aesthetic experience, I think we should tap onto this distinct layer and not fuse them or confound them, because otherwise we come up with unintelligible results. So what we tentatively distinguished was mere observation, that's trivial, aesthetic attitude, aesthetic experience, aesthetic appraisal, and aesthetic judgment. And I tend to believe that each of these single dimensions taps into distinct activation of distinct neural networks, so to speak. Okay, I open my eyes, I look at the Golden Gate, okay? But I'm feeling my text form, okay? So that Golden Gate, the beautiful Bay Area, starts leaving, has an impact on my rods, my cones, my ganglion cells, and all the way through the visual pathway, so they're all investigated by Samir Zeki and other colleagues. Okay. So I have a piece of the physical world which has an impact on my visual system. Okay. Then the next day, the tax form is filled. I'm still sitting in the very same chair, looking out, seeing the Golden Gate at sunset. This time I turn on the stereo and I'm listening to David Crosby. Tamalpais High, from If I Could Only Remember My Name. Great, great. Okay? So, great music. The picture is, the image is identical, but my experience of the Bay and of the Golden Gate is dramatically different. What does it mean? It means that there is a substantial projective component in my experience of that image. So, how I make sense of that image, it cannot be uniquely explained by charting a bunch of visual areas in my brain. So the aesthetic attitude is what was absent when I was feeling my tax form and was present when I was led to look at the Bay being driven by the music, by the West Coast music. So it is the implicit mindset enabling one to appreciate the aesthetic content of the contemplated object by focusing attention on its aesthetic qualities, which leads to aesthetic experience. Aesthetic experience, in turn, is the response to perceptual objects, and in my model, consists of the embodied simulation of the actions, emotion, sensations that the content, if there is such a content, the object evokes in the beholder. It also activates memories that are related to that very same object, which obviously will be different according to the different individual that is putting herself in that aesthetic mindset which leads to that specific aesthetic experience. So such experience is, of course, not necessarily confined to the appreciation of artworks, although it grounds it. Let's move to aesthetic appraisal. By aesthetic appraisal, I mean the subjective evaluation of an object based on an introspective identification of the emotional and bodily responses to the object. So it is not necessarily the expression of a high-order cognitive consideration and mechanism, but might well be rather the outcome of association processes between the perceptual object and the beholder emotional memories, once more. It basically answers the question, do you like it? And finally, we have aesthetic judgment, which is the explicit aesthetic rating of an object according to culturally and socially determined aesthetic canons. And it represents the most cognitive aspect and the most socially constructed aspect of aesthetic experience. It's the most cognitive way to establish a relationship with the artwork, and basically it boils down to answering the question, is it beautiful, which can be as different are the many cultures that our species was able to express. So we go to a museum when people are still paying a few minutes of attention without taking a snapshot and running away. Most likely these people photographed by Thomas Truth are enjoying an aesthetic experience like these other folks at the Art Institute of Chicago. But vision is a lot more than the activation of the visual brain. There has been so far a sort of visual imperialism, which has reduced all of our visual enterprises to the activation of the so-called visual part of the brain, which is illustrated in these two cartoons, which are taken from standard neuroscience handbooks. This is false, by the way. Observing the world, and therefore also observing visual artworks, is a much more complex enterprise than the mere activation of the visual brain, because it implies a multimodal notion of vision. Observing the world encompasses the activation, as we have seen, of somatosensory, emotion-related components, motor components, within the more general frame of the intrinsic pragmatic nature of every intentional relation with the world. So to quote Heidegger, the world we live in is not exclusively vorhanden, but is also most of the time zuhanden, ready to hand. So we are constantly enmeshed in a potentially pragmatic relationship with the world. Not only when I'm speaking about bottles or glasses to be grasped, but even when I move my eyes around an object to appreciate its depth and shape. So one crucial problem concerns the specific quality of aesthetic experience related to artworks. And David Freedberg, who is an art historian at Columbia University, in the 80s wrote this book, The Power of Images, which was really a book that was totally out of the mainstream, because most of his colleagues were, when dealing with the aesthetic experience and art, were talking about cognition, were talking about concepts. While in this book, David was vindicating a very important role for emotions. And many years later, we got to know each other, and we finally wrote a paper that was published in this journal, Trends in Cognitive Science. And by the way, David was really annoyed. Then it was the time of the Da Vinci Code. And he was very annoyed when he realized that they decided to put the Mona Lisa on the cover of the journal. So what we said in this paper is basically the following. First, a crucial element of aesthetic response to artworks consists of the activation of embodied mechanisms that, as I said, encompass the simulation of action, emotion, and corporeal sensation. These mechanisms are, of course, socioculturally modulated, but here I'm uttering in the humanities-oriented environment a five-letter words, universal. So this basic level of reaction to images is supposedly essential to the understanding of the effectiveness both of everyday images but also of works of art. So the first step we took was to provide a sort of epoche. So if you want to understand what's going on when I have an aesthetic experience facing an artwork, first of all, I should treat the artwork as an object in itself. So on top of its intrinsic artistic qualities, there is something which the beholding of this object shares with the beholding also of other objects which are not intrinsically artistic. And the relevance of movement in visual aesthetics is also a very old story. And allow me to quote briefly, this is the Laocoon, and Anna Wieczowski wrote a beautiful chapter in her last book on group identity in Renaissance. And something I didn't know at all was through reading of her book to discover that the word gruppo, group, didn't exist as such before they were able to dig out this marmoreal group near Rome in the Renaissance. There were other words referring to cohorts of people, but not group. Gruppo, which comes from groppo, which means knot, became a commonly circulated word after the discovery of the Laocoon. Nevertheless, here is Eisenstein towards a theory of montage. Here the model, referring to the group, to the Laocoon, appears to be perfect both in the phase of external movement, the attack of the snakes, and in the crescendo phase of sufferance solved by the gradation of character's behavior. He's trying to get rid of the snake. He's already lost. But, continues Eisenstein, the most interesting thing of Laocoon is the head of the central character. The fact is that the lived expression of human sufferance is obtained by the illusion of movement, and such illusion is achieved with a procedure representing the development of sufferance within a configuration it could not possibly show simultaneously. When we look at the static image of an action, we still do activate its motor representation. So you don't need to see a moving hand that grasps the bottle to evoke the embodied simulation of that motor acts. Also, beholding the static image of accomplished action like taking hold of a bottle of Coke leads to the activation of the hand motor representation in the brain of the observer. And the more dynamic is the static image, the more your motor brain activates, as shown by this EG recent study. But in principle, if this is true, and it is highly debatable that what I told you might be proven to be entirely true, things may get even worse when there's nothing to resonate with, when there is no compianto sul Cristo morto, when there is no Laocoon, where there is no incredulity of Thomas to be embodied. When we have abstract expressionism, for example, Pollock, de Kooning, or we have Fontana. What do we resonate with here? So we decided to start exactly from here, because I took it to be trivial, so to speak, to start with Caravaggio. Although David continuously is telling me, look, what we are saying is by no means trivial. Actually, we got booed when we normally address art historian making the story I'm telling you today. So most of the people don't buy it. Thinks it's either irrelevant or it's false. So anyway, we decided, I like high stakes, so we decided to start with Fontana. But again, this is not by all means a new idea. If you read this as an artist, I think it was negligible. But as someone who thought about aesthetics, much more interesting, Adolf von Hildebrand, and this small book played an enormous influence in those times, The Problem of Form in Figurative Art. Creation and response to art are directly related. To understand an artistic image means to implicitly grasp its creative process. Further, the aesthetic value of artworks would reside in their potential to establish a link between the intentional creative acts of the artist and their reconstruction on the side of the beholder. And once more, Warburg, these engrams of emotional experience, the pathos formen, survive as the inherited legacy of memory, determining in exemplary mode the contour created by the artist's hand when the highest values of gestural language emerge in artistic creation by means of his hand. Okay, so the next point we made in the 207 paper, David and I, was the following. The felt effect of particular gestures involved in producing artworks constitutes a consistent component of our aesthetic experience and appreciation of artworks. So here is Lucio Fontana at work in his atelier, and here are the consequences of his hand gesture, the cut. So what we did, we took a sample of young adults, psychology undergraduate and medical undergraduates. We convinced them to wear this peculiar cap, which is a high-density EEG, 128 electrodes, and we had them to look into a video screen where we projected digitized high-definition images of Fontana cuts, and this work was mainly done by Maria Alessandro Umiltà and Cristina Berchio, with the help, of course, of David. So, blank screen, fixation cross, 1 second, the visual stimulus appears, blank screen again for 5 seconds. Which stimuli and by means of EEG, what we were measuring was the sensory motor alpha desynchronization, which is an indirect fingerprint of the activation of your mirror neurons. So alpha desynchronization, when recorded from central electrodes, signifies that your motor representation is being activated. Okay? So you are simulating hand movements in your motor part of the brain. So we randomly alternated the digitized version of the original artworks of Lucio Fontana with photoshopped modified version where simply the cut is replaced by a line which has the same width and the same length. At the end, the word art was never mentioned while we did this EEG recording. What we said to all participants was, try not to move, try to blink the less you can, because eye blinks brings in a lot of motion artifacts. Look carefully what you will be seeing, period, okay? At the end of the experiment, we asked them a lot of questions. How did you like, so we played again all the images, so the original and the control stimuli, asking them, how do you like it? Please rate these images, -10 ugly, +10 incredibly nice. If and how much movement do you perceive in this image, in this static image, that to most of them seems a weird question to be asked. And finally, and most importantly, if and how Are you familiar with this image? It turned out that half of the people never heard of Lucio Fontana. Sadly, they didn't know about Lucio Fontana. They never saw these images, while the other half did. And the results is the following. Only the condition effect was significant, namely, only during the observation of the original artworks we were able to measure a motor simulation in the brain of the beholders, most importantly, independently from stimulus familiarity. So we recorded the very same effect in the people who knew Lucio Fontana, but also in those that didn't know anything about him. Okay, let me be very clear. My point is the following. If instead of showing cuts made by Lucio Fontana, I did the cut myself, we would have had the very same results. Okay? So the point is not that you induce in your brain a motor simulation only if what you are seeing is an artistic cut, which wouldn't possibly make any sense. What I'm saying is that whenever you see a cut, you simulate the gesture produced, executed to produce the cut. And this occurs whether you know that this is a cut or not, whether you know it is an artistic cut or not. So what? The point I want to make is that a consistent embodied aspect of my aesthetic experience when facing a Fontana is this effect. And the next point I want to make is that the emotion I may or may not derive from beholding this image is also partly due to this embodied simulation that goes on in my brain as I'm facing Lucio Fontana. I don't want to make a big point out of this, but I may add that aesthetic judgment was higher for the original cuts with respect to the control stimuli, again, regardless of familiarity. So the cuts on the canvas are the visible traces of goal-directed movements, hints capable of activating the relevant motor areas in the observer brain. So the idea is that the artwork becomes the mediator of the motor and emotional resonance which arises between the artist and the observer. And therefore, the sensory motor component of stimulus processing represent the most direct, by no means the unique, only the most direct fruition level, which allows the beholder to feel the artwork in an embodied manner. I would expect to see the same effect if I show a Van Gogh with the very materic consequences of the way he painted the painting. Let me get quickly to the conclusions. What can neuroscience tell us on aesthetic experience? I think it can help to rediscover the role of the acting body in intersubjectivity, even if we are dealing with a mediated form of intersubjectivity, as I said at the beginning. So embodied simulation generates the peculiar quality of the embodied seen as that I think plays a significant role in aesthetic experience, although it's only one component, as I said, of aesthetic experience. And I think it is one important ingredient of our appreciation of art. There's one last aspect that I will not elaborate too much today, but which I think might also be interesting, at least to introduce to you. How comes that quite often, although we had a discussion with my wife on this specific topic, she was not fully convinced that you can make this statement all the time, but many people believe in what I'm about to say, and namely that artistic fiction often is more powerful than real life in evoking our emotional engagement and empathic involvement. Why? Well, one way to go that I would like to only suggest, because I'm out of time, perhaps because in aesthetic experience we temporarily suspend our grip on the world, and therefore we are capable of liberating new energies and put them into the service of a new dimension that, paradoxically as it may sound, can be more vivid than prosaic reality. So aesthetic experience of artworks can be described as a sort of suspension of disbelief, okay? We know it since, who was it, Coleridge? But I would like to complement this cognitive side of aesthetic experience with a more, I'm an embodiment chap, so I always try to find something, not alternative, but that can complement the most highly cognitive description of anything related to human beings. So this embodied complement to suspension of disbelief is what, and in the paper with Hanna Wieczowski, we discussed it a little more in detail. I call it liberated embodied simulation. If you think about it, when you read a novel, you are still, you are sitting. Well, with audiobook, maybe you can jog, but this is not the standard way people, at least until now, read books or novels. When you are at a museum, you may move slightly backward and forward just to match your viewing angle with the light, but most of the time you are still. Similarly, you are still when you are sitting in a movie theater, when you are attending to a theatrical play, to a dance performance. And this is very important. You are still, so which means that you can somehow loosen your guard, your defense mechanism. When you are on a subway, you may well witness some passionate love example, people kissing each other, people telling each other loving words, or you may witnessing a fight. But if you witness the fight, you might easily become all of a sudden part of that plot. You stare at the guy, you're looking at me, and all of a sudden you find yourself punched on your face. So this trivial example is telling you that we are inhabiting a totally different world when we are having an aesthetic experience. We actually were able to build a very specific environment. If you think about ancient Greek theater, there is always a safety distance between where the theatrical action goes on and when the audience is sitting. So this physical distance multiplies the possibility to allocate more bodily resources in the fruition of what you are beholding. So we look at art from a distance of safety from which our being open to the world gets magnified. So in that respect, I think that to appreciate art means leaving the world behind while simultaneously enjoying the possibility to more fully grasp it. And I end with another totally non-actual a quote from Lichtenberg. So we are back to physiognomy, but I think physiognomic, but I think it tells you something very modern. Our body stands in between our soul and the external world, mirroring the effects of both. And I think cognitive neuroscience can rediscover this truth, although from a totally different point of view. Thank you.